Welcome to this Tuesday's session of the Redundancy All Access, Full Access, I guess I should say, webinar series. Today's topic is ThinManager. Steve Huck will be hosting our session. He's one of our automation and software specialists, and we'll be covering practices for getting the most out of a ThinManager deployment. So with that, I thank Steve. I will turn it over to you to get us started.
Thanks so much, Julia. And thanks for joining us today. We do have a lot to cover, so we're going to jump right in. And although this webinar is going to focus on the best practices, tips, and tricks that's promised in the title, we are going to spend just a little bit of time in the beginning with an overview of ThinManager and its capabilities, just to set up the foundation for the rest of the session. Let's take a look at the agenda. As I said, we're going to start off with an overview of ThinManager, what it is, why it is used. This will also include information on thin client hardware and options. Then we're going to briefly touch on licensing, not just ThinManager licensing, but also associated licensing like Microsoft Remote Desktop CALs and how Rockwell software licensing works in the ThinManager system. After licensing, we'll look at some best practices for architecting a managed ThinManager solution, and then switch to focus on security and networking best practices. Finally, we'll go through some miscellaneous tips and tricks that'll hopefully help everyone get the most out of their ThinManager deployment, and then answer any remaining questions that we haven't gotten to as we go through. Again, feel free to ask questions along the way, or we can do questions at the end of each section, whatever is convenient, just let me know. We'll go from there. So let's get started with ThinManager. So why use ThinManager? Why do customers use ThinManager, and what problems are they trying to solve? We'll start on the right-hand side here, left-hand side here, and we'll work our way right and down. But replacing PCs with thin clients to reduce the maintenance and downtime. This was always the main driver for ThinManager. Thin clients tend to have a lower total cost of ownership than regular PCs. They last longer. Removing operating systems from the plant floor, consolidating applications to run on a few servers, and that really reduces the maintenance and downtime. Also, replacing terminals. Replacing a down thin client can be done in minutes by nearly anyone can be trained to do it, instead of hours that it might take to replace a computer, even if you have well-managed images to replace from. This is what we consider, productivity, and this is how ThinManager helps to increase productivity. Jumping up to the next column, we'll talk about enhancing that user experience or the operator experience for all devices. Delivering the current applications that you have to virtually any device, whether it be a PC, a thin client, a mobile device, anywhere in the plant. That's a huge benefit of ThinManager. Having applications follow users from terminal to terminal with a simple login or a badge reader, fingerprint scanner, facial recognition, whatever it takes to log in. My applications come with me as I go from terminal to terminal around the plant. And controlling exactly how applications are displayed and shared across every monitor, every display, everywhere in the plant. The latest versions of ThinManager and the latest thin clients that are supported, ThinManager ready clients, support up to 7 monitors on a single client terminal. That's pretty substantial. And this is how ThinManager can help enhance the visualization into your facility and your process. Jumping to the next column, we're going to talk about security. Increasing security by reducing the network surface area. Security is a huge thing right now. Not only is there's no data stored on a thin client, but in most cases, if you're using ThinManager ready clients or what we call zero clients, there's no hard drive to even store data on that client. So you're seriously reducing the attack surface area that traditional PCs would have in a deployment. Also, delivering only the applications that you want users to access without a desktop or without access to anything else. It ensures that every person is focused on their specific role and not necessarily doing things that don't offer up good value to the company. Another very large thing here would be the ThinManager terminals themselves. When you look at a thin client terminal, by default, out of the box, They will not accept mass storage devices like a USB thumb drive or an external hard drive. It prevents theft of proprietary information. I mean, there's nothing there. You can't, it doesn't recognize a thumb drive or a USB hard drive or anything, and no data could be taken off of that terminal in that way. And that really is industrial security that's controlled by ThinManager. Moving up to the last column, deploying the most secure industrial mobility solution without writing or rewriting any code. Mobility is a giant factor for for recent ThinManager deployments for our customers. Being able to use what we call location resolvers, such as Wi-Fi access points or Bluetooth beacons, QR codes or GPS coordinates to actually restrict the delivery of content to a mobile device within a certain area in your plant. Deny it if you move outside of a certain area, you lose certain content. Very powerful. Delivering existing content and applications to iOS, Android, and Windows-based mobile devices without having to rewrite any code. Again, ThinManager makes that possible. And what's really important when we're talking about mobility is ThinManager does not store any device, any type of data on the local device, on the mobile device. When a ThinManager device is being used as a mobile device, all of that information, all that data, that is stored back at the ThinManager server area, at the source, at the content. And when that session is over, there is no way to retrieve that data on that mobile device. And this is why ThinManager is the simplest way to implement secure mobility in an industrial environment. So whether you're looking to increase productivity, enhance visualization, tighten security, or take advantage of mobility without reinventing the wheel, ThinManager is the solution that we have to offer. What is ThinManager? Let's go back to the core thing. So what is ThinManager? ThinManager, in a nutshell, is a content delivery and device management platform. So when I'm talking about content, we'll look on the left-hand side under the red heading here, content types. We can get content from lots of different sources. Using VNC, we can access PanelView plus 6.7 terminals, as well as PanelView 5000 terminals. Any HMI that supports VNC can be used as a source of content within ThinManager. Moving into the next grouping, we're talking about Windows applications, whether those are HMI applications, whether those are solitaire, it doesn't matter. If it runs in a Windows environment, it can be shared as content through ThinManager. Web content, whether that be internal or external web pages, web-based reporting. A lot of devices, especially Ethernet devices on the plant floor nowadays, have device web pages within them where you can see settings. That's all content that can be shared. And of course, IP-based and USB cameras, that's just another source of content. ThinManager can take that, you can decide how you want to deliver it securely, and then send it out to the plant floor. When we look at how ThinManager delivers content, that's when we're going to focus here on the right side under the green heading delivery. We're talking about 3 ways to deliver content: by device, by user, or by location. By device is fairly simple to imagine what I'm talking about here. Every ThinManager managed device, every client or terminal has a unique ThinManager profile that can be given to it. That profile can say, I want this HMI delivered here. And from that point on, anytime that device fires up, that profile is delivered, that content's delivered, I get it there. By user is where some of the power of ThinManager really starts to come in. This would be as I move around the plant and go from location to location. If I'm a maintenance guy, maybe no matter where I log in, sure, that terminal is still getting its HMI for the terminal because I'm delivering it by terminal. But as I log in as a specific user from the maintenance department, maybe I receive Logix Designer so that I can go online with the controller. Or maybe I receive my work order client so I can look and see what I'm supposed to do that day, no matter what terminal I log into. And then location takes that to the next level. And this is where the heart of the mobility initiative built into ThinManager. Gives us the ability to take content and assign it to an area or a location and then deliver it to mobile clients or physical clients at any location based on where we are. So simple example would be a QR code. You could take a QR code, a sticker, stick it on a panel. I could walk up to that panel with my mobile device, scan that QR code, and based on the fact that it knows I've scanned that QR code, it delivers Logix Designer with the ACD file loaded up, and now I can take a look and troubleshoot that application. Another example would be to take that to the next level and go from QR codes to Bluetooth beacons or Wi-Fi access points and even GPS coordinates. You can take those, create a geofence or an area location within ThinManager. Now, as I come in with my mobile device, I'm a maintenance guy, I can log in. It sees, yep, I'm within the designated area of that Bluetooth strength or that Wi-Fi access strength. It delivers the content that I want for that particular area. If I walk out, so say I want to deliver only when I'm in line of sight, but if I walk too far away or if I go to the break room, that content goes away. I don't have access to it until I return to that area. Extremely powerful, and this is what makes ThinManager an extremely powerful tool to implement mobility on the plant floor. Take a quick look at some of the Thin client hardware, and then we'll see if there's any questions that pop up after that. Thin client hardware. When we look at ThinManager, we can talk about basically three different types or three different groups of clients that can be used. First one, starting on the left, would be ThinManager ready clients. Thin clients that are ThinManager ready, these would be thin clients with the ThinManager BIOS built in on board. These thin clients connect directly to the ThinManager server, receive their firmware and their configuration right out of the box. The ThinManager ready clients, they're also what we refer to as zero clients because they have no hard drives, they have no operating systems. They are truly a secure, safe, lockdown piece of equipment. Middle column here, we're talking about ThinManager compatible. Now, a ThinManager compatible client could be a thin client or even any x86 based computer, standard PC. These devices, they don't have the ThinManager BIOS built into them. They may not know what ThinManager is, but these clients can use the pre-boot execution environment or what they call the PXE boot to obtain the firmware and the configuration from ThinManager, and they can be managed exactly the same as a ThinManager ready client once that is set up initially. So out of the box, you do have some configuration with a non-ThinManager ready client where you have to set up that PXE, that pre-boot execution environment. Once you've done that, you can then boot that directly like any other ThinManager ready client, and ThinManager takes over from there. The last column over on the far right is a ThinManager client, and these would be devices that are going to run a ThinManager client application on their operating system. So WinTMC is an application that runs on both Windows PCs and Windows mobile devices. ATMC runs on Android operating system devices, and ITMZ runs on Apple iOS devices. So if you have a mobile device, a tablet, a phone, you can take these, download these apps, you can install them on there. You're not going to overwrite anything. You're not going to change firmware on these particular devices. They still have their standard operating system, but once you launch that app and it's connected to the ThinManager server, ThinManager now manages that client the same as it would any other client, whether it be ThinManager ready or compatible. So when looking at the choice or consideration when you're choosing thin clients, it's not the same as when you pick out maybe a PC where we're concerned about how much hard drive space you have or how quick the processor is. Those things are a little less important because the servers tend to do most of the heavy lifting when it comes to thin clients. But things that are important would be how many video outputs are needed. So how many monitors will you be connected to your terminal? Or how many USB ports will you need? You know, I already said that out of the box, the USB ports will only recognize a keyboard or a mouse, so that thumb drive won't work. But if you wanted to make it so that a USB camera or a badge reader or a biometric sensor, any of these type of things could be implemented through your thin client, ThinManager allows us to do that by adding a module into the firmware to control that device. So you have to take those type of things into consideration. And the knowledge base document at the bottom of the screen there talks about not just supported hardware, but also some selection considerations for thin client hardware. This next slide here, just a quick chart overview of Rockwell's VERSAVIEW family of thin clients. So both the VERSAVIEW 5200 and VERSAVIEW 6300 thin clients are represented here. And they're all fanless, designed for the industrial environment. All are ThinManager ready, meaning right out of the box, they work with ThinManager. You don't have to pixie boot these. These are set up with the ThinManager BIOS in the actual firmware, ready to go. The 6300, starting on the left there, it's a 4K single output. Then the 5200s range from single 1080p outputs to multi, dual display outputs and dual display 4K outputs, all the way up to 3 or 7 4K outputs from one terminal. In the middle, we have the integrated display clients. These would be the 5200 panel thin clients. They range in screen sizes from 12.1 to 21.5-inch screens, and each one includes or has built into it one display port out, which allows you to tie into a second monitor, so you can do multi-monitor even from the integrated display version. Jumping into the ThinManager user interface, ThinManager is set up to be OT friendly. Although the concepts of what ThinManager allows us to do are very powerful and in a lot of cases feel like maybe IT concepts, the way in which it's delivered or the way in which we configure these things are all wizard-based, tab-based, and very OT-centric. So if we take a look at the sections or tabs that it's divided up into, the 5 major ones where you configure most of what you need within the ThinManager environment would be display servers. Now, display servers are where you configure the source of the content you're going to share up. Display clients. This is where you actually configure the individual applications or the content sessions themselves. How will those be delivered? Terminals. This is where you set up your thin client profiles or the terminals that you will then, this profile will then be given out to the actual pieces of hardware, and that's how it knows what it is and what it's supposed to do. Users, pretty self-explanatory, but this is where you would set up user groups and users so that you can deliver content to users, but also decide what users have the rights to have access to. So certain users may not be able to log into certain content, whether they're on specific terminals or whether they're on any terminal. And then locations. This is where you would actually define those locations within your plant and the resolvers that you're using to define those, whether it be a QR code, whether it be Bluetooth, whatever it might be, that gets set up here. I'm going to jump back to the display clients because I think it's kind of important to go over this. This is the content itself, the stuff that we're serving out over ThinManager. And on the left-hand side here, I go down the different types of display client definitions, how we can set them up. Remote desktop server sessions are very common. But you can also use a one-to-one relationship. You can use remote desktop protocol to access a workstation, a Windows 10 or a Windows 7 computer, and share that as well. DNC, we talked about using the panel view pluses in terms of other computers that support that, whatever you need. DNC is there. The cameras, and then terminal shadowing allows you to actually go from one terminal to another without necessarily duplicating that work. You can just shadow it. But what I really want to focus on is the different, I guess, features that can be set up on display clients. And a few of them we're going to touch on here: multi-monitor, multi-session or session tiling, and virtual screening. Just because I think they're extremely powerful. And so rather than going through PowerPoint on those, I think what we'll do is I'll just pop over to my thin client. Hopefully that is visible to you guys here. What we have here is this is a thin client running just an HMI application. So I'm going to go ahead and get my bar out of the way here. There we go, perfect. And I'm going to jump to, how do I get rid of this bar? Perfect. Sorry, I had to move something. I'm going to jump over to my ThinManager environment real quick, and I'm going to show you on that Thin client, I'm serving up a standard HMI sending a piece of information. But if I had multiple monitors instead of one, if that Thin client was capable of handling more than a single monitor, I could go ahead and enable multi-monitor. In this case, I'll go ahead and I'll just add, maybe I'll add, I don't know, 5 monitors. Let's have some 5 monitors, all the same resolution. I can then go ahead and choose a layout, how I want that to be configured, how it's going to look. And in this case, we'll go with something like this. So I have my 5 monitors positioned here. This is how they're going to be set up, maybe in my control room. Now I get to assign content or what I want to assign screen layout wise. So yeah, we'll have the first one be A. We'll make the one above that B. We'll make that one C. And then just for fun, we'll spread D across 2 monitors. So basically what I've done here is whatever content I assign to screen A, screen B, and screen C will show up on the respective monitors. But that content that I assign to screen D will actually spread across both monitors, spread right out. As long as they match in resolution, you can spread it right across the monitors, and I'll have a much wider view of that. And in the next screen here, this is where I would actually go ahead and assign my content to A, B, C, and D. I'm actually not going to do that because I don't have the capability of doing that right now. I don't have multi-monitors. But maybe what we'll do instead is we'll go ahead and show you what tiling does. So instead of enabling multi-monitor, I've told it right now I'm delivering this cookie demo, but I'm also going to come in here and I'm going to say at the same time, let's go ahead and grab the, I don't know, let's grab the packaging demo. Let's grab the ops scorecard. And finally, let's go out. Anybody joined us last week for the PanaView 5000, we'll use the PanaView 5510 here. So I'll just go ahead and add those, just dump them into there, restart the client, which always has to be done when you make changes. Come over here and wait patiently for the client to pop up. And as it does, what you'll see is instead of just having my cookie demo fill my screen, ThinManager is tiled or broken into tiles the 4 separate content pieces that I said I wanted to share with this one thing. So what's very powerful here is I now have 4 completely different pieces of content on one terminal. I don't have to have a separate KVM to have different keyboards and mice channeled through so the operator can use one. And I can bounce from one unit to the next. And I have things set up so that if I click on it with the left button, I go to full screen. And I have the ability to then move around and do what I want. I also put on side sliding. So what that basically means is I can go from content to content simply by going back and forth. And then if I right click anywhere, it goes right back to tiling because I set those things up in ThinManager to happen. So this is tiling, and this is very powerful. ThinManager allows you to do a 5x5 tile grid. So that means you can have up to 25 individual sessions or pieces of content shared on any one monitor or any one screen. And that's very powerful. Some of the drawbacks to tiling, I don't really have control over how this goes. This looks great right now because I threw 4 pieces of content on. If I were to throw a 5th piece on, we're going to wind up with some letterboxing or some black areas of the screen because it won't be able to equally distribute that into a nice sort of breakout on the screen that way. So what I'm going to do in those instances, when you want to take tiling a little bit further, we're going to go ahead and jump back to our configuration. And we'll modify one last time here. And I'm just going to get rid of all that content. And I'm going to go grab a virtual screen. And I've already configured this virtual screen for my control room just to save us some time. We go ahead and restart that terminal again. I'm going to pop over and we'll wait for it here. And the virtual screen allows you to deliver those multi-sessions, that multiple pieces of content. In this case, it's all the same content exactly as we were seeing before, but now I have control over it. So I have a main control area here in the center where our cookie demo is. And in there, I have full control. I can move around, I can jump around and do the things that I'm supposed to do. Meanwhile, along the side here, I've got other content that I wanted to have that was valuable. And if I click on that, it moves to the main area. And now I have full capabilities to move around and do what I want to do and see what's going on. anytime I want, I can shift those sessions back and forth and out. I can get my reporting here and go in and check that out, or I can go ahead and get back in and do things. So it's just a virtual screening gives you the ability to sort of configure the layout as opposed to just tiling, which is a ThinManager doing the best it can to lay it out in a way that makes the most sense. So before we jump out of here, I'm just going to go ahead and throw on our standard HMI back on here again. Let's give it one screen to worry about, our cookie demo. That's the one I tend to fall back on. And I'll reboot it. And just to get one last little thing in here before we jump out, I'll just show you how we deliver content by user. So I've assigned this piece of content to the device, so it's always going to get this. But if I log in as a maintenance user, and I'm going to scan so that we don't have to waste time, and I'm just going to go ahead and tile it so we can see this. So I've logged in now as Mark, my maintenance guy, and as Mark logs in, no matter where Mark logs in, he gets his work orders so he can take a look and see what he's supposed to be working on. But at the same time, because I've delivered the HMI to the device, that's always going to be there. So it's here, and Mark can jump back and forth between them the same way that I had things set up before. One thing you may notice is that when Mark has logged into this terminal, it also passed his ThinManager login directly down into FactoryTalk View SE. So that if Mark happens to be here doing stuff and he makes changes and we're logging those changes, it's not going to be the operator that made those changes. We know it was Mark who made those changes, and we can see that on any of the event logs that we look at. But what's important to remember about that is that's something ThinManager version 10 and FactoryTalk View SE 10 or higher is necessary for that. You also need to use linked users to an Active Directory, as well as, so the ThinManager user has to be linked to the Active Directory, and the FactoryTalk user has to be linked to the Active Directory. But once you've done that, you get that. So I'm going to go ahead and log Mark out here. And when I do that, right away, I've lost the other session of his, and shortly thereafter, you can see he's logged out, and we're back to our default login. So that's delivering by user, and that content can go ahead and follow Mark no matter where he goes. I'm going to go ahead and bail out of this and go back to our presentation. Hopefully we're back there. And the last thing I wanted to really focus on ThinManager before we get into licensing and some of the other best practices and stuff is the location-based stuff. So when we're talking about delivering by location and we're talking about mobility, you can resolve those locations, or you can define those locations very simply. You can use QR codes, and those are the easiest way. You can print those out, usually for free, stick them on things. You know, we have some customers that have had them etched into panels so that they last a little longer. But then you go out, you scan it, you deliver content that way. You can also, like I said before, use Bluetooth or wireless access points. And I like to point out the HMS wireless bolt. Simultaneously, it's a wireless access point and a Bluetooth access point or Bluetooth beacon. So you can basically put a 50mm hole in your panel, drop this in, connect it up on the inside to your Ethernet network, and it becomes a wireless access point and a Bluetooth access point or Bluetooth beacon that you can then use ThinManager to define an area that then will allow certain content to be delivered. So before we jump into licensing, does anyone have any questions on ThinManager, the overview, and any ThinManager hardware questions? Did anything come up in the chat? I don't think so. So I think we'll just go ahead in the interest of time and jump right ahead. So ThinManager licensing, how is it licensed? ThinManager named their licensing VFlex. It's their term for licensing, and so we call it VFlex licensing. And the flex part is the important part to focus on. It's very flexible. We're going to talk about that in the next couple of slides. But VFlex licensing, in order to go ahead and base what licensing you're going to buy, it's based on 3 different factors. So first and foremost, the license quantity is based on your client or terminal count. So regardless of what you're planning to do, if you have 5 terminal clients and maybe 2 or 3 mobile clients that you're going to be using. So you got 7, maybe 8 clients. You would purchase your ThinManager licensing in the quantity of the clients you're going to use. The VFlex is flexible in the fact that if you decide later you want to break that up, okay, so I bought 5 clients, or say I bought 50 clients, I can set that up with a single ThinManager server with 50 Thin clients available to it, or I can set that up with 50 ThinManager servers with 1 client each set up to it, or anywhere in between. That's the flexibility of the VFlex licensing. So once purchased, you're purchasing it by the client count, but you're actually, every client license actually has the ability to be its own independent server, so you can break it up in any way that makes sense. The other 2 factors you need to worry about when you're speccing out a license, when you're picking a license, would be your platform maintenance support level. So whether you want Monday to Friday 8 to 5 support or 24/7 support, and then whether or not you want to add on redundancy, yes or no. Do I want redundant ThinManager servers? And we'll talk about what redundancy is, but it's basically a pair of ThinManager installations where the database is automatically synchronized between them, so that if your ThinManager server goes down, your secondary server is there to still deliver firmware and content profiles to your Thin clients. So that would be ThinManager redundancy. When we look at the licensing, there is a volume discount on the pricing of the licensing. So the more client terminals that you purchase, the less expensive each terminal is. And we're going to use an example of a company with 3 facilities here that are going to buy a certain number of clients. And in this case, they've figured out at the 3 different A, B, and C facilities how many licenses they would need or how many client terminals they're going to use at each one, added them all together and came up with a number, 78. 78 falls right in the smack and dab in the middle of the 50 to 99. So that's a 50% off of the price. It's a nice volume reduction if they go ahead and buy that. But at the same time, in looking at the breakpoints, which we'll show in a minute, customer decided, hey, you know what, instead I'm going to go ahead and hit 100 client terminal connections. And that gives me 22 spares. Those spares could be spread out over my 3 locations or even spun up as new servers in other locations, other ThinManager instances. So to see how that really works, let's take a look at each location and figure out what would have happened if they bought things individually and how that prices out. So if you take a look at Allentown, our first location A, they have 27 terminals. If they just bought those licenses for themselves, that falls within the 5 to 49 discount range or 45% off. For they to come in at a little over $35,000 for ThinManager. Newark has a few more, they have 33, but it still falls within that same 5 to 49 volume license discount area, so they get the same discount. They would have spent a little bit more at $43,560. And then finally up at Rochester, they only had 18. Unfortunately, 18 is still right there in that same breakdown, that 5 to 49, so they're paying the same amount. When you look at it, the company overall pays close to $103,000 for ThinManager licensing. Now, if they got smart and they all talked to each other first and they planned this out from the beginning and they said, okay, we're going to buy 78 licenses and then share them throughout our facility, that's great. That brings that price, because we've moved that 78 from that 5 to 49 now into that 50 to 99 range discount. They wind up spending almost 10 grand less. So that's a great discount. That's fantastic. But the reason this customer decided, hey, you know what, we're going to go ahead and bump up to the 100, and we're going to have 22 spare licenses in case we want to do more mobility or in case we want to spread that out or even spin something up at a new location somewhere else. Because again, each one of those licenses are unrestricted. They can be used independently as their own server and client, or they can be added on to an existing one. The reason they went ahead and did that is because jumping up to that next volume discount means that for $2,400 more, they wind up with 22 spare licenses or 100 licenses total. So that's the way VFlex licensing works. That's sort of the breakdown. Rockwell's licensing and pricing changes quite often. So this is currently right now where we're at. But more importantly, what I wanted to show here is those breakpoints I was talking about. If you're looking at implementing 3 Thin clients, you're probably better off going ahead and buying 5, because not only will it be either the same price or less, but it gives you some spare, some breathing room. And these breakpoints are the same whether you're looking at perpetual licensing, where you purchase the license and then just pay for the support on that license, or whether you're looking at a subscription model for those licenses where you're paying one fee annually to get both the licensing and the support that you need for ThinManager. So those breakpoints are very important. This slide hopefully can help you to remember those and factor them in when you're speccing out. Some of the other licensing considerations I wanted to talk about with ThinManager would be remote desktop licensing. So when you're talking about ThinManager, we almost always talk about remote desktop. It's not necessary for ThinManager, but it really does simplify, and it ties that whole centralized management idea back. Rather than having individual applications running on individual devices, you're now going to bring that back, run those in remote desktop servers, and share those out. Well, in order to do that, you need remote desktop client access licenses, because you're not buying operating systems. You're not going to buy 10 Windows 10 operating systems. You're instead going to get 10 remote desktop server CALs. And so Microsoft offers those CALs in per user or per device option. And per device is generally more suited to the ThinManager deployment because we're already set up in a per device environment. When you look at ThinManager and you say, I'm going to deploy ThinManager here with 5 Thin clients, you're saying that there are going to be 5 devices that access ThinManager for content. So those 5 CALs or 5 remote desktop client access licenses by device means that no matter how many sessions are being delivered to any independent terminal, it's by device. So you get a single CAL consumed, and it can consume an SE session, it can consume logics, it can consume anything that you need it to consume. So that is a huge advantage, and it's something that some of our customers make a mistake with. If you wind up buying the user versus the device, you can wind up in a situation where you actually wind up needing more CALs, more remote desktop CALs, to go ahead and run your applications the way you want on your Thin clients than if you go with per device. Another consideration is FactoryTalk licensing. And when we talk about FactoryTalk licensing, FactoryTalk View SE client, when you look at it, if you deploy a FactoryTalk View SE system, you generally need a client license for every client in your system, similar to Studio 5000, Logix Designer, and other Rockwell products. For every instance that you're going to deploy, you need a license. What happened in version 11 of ThinManager and FactoryTalk View SE is that Rockwell has allowed us, or has created an environment where we developed this very similar relationship as a per device licensing model. So what winds up happening here, and we'll show this in a couple of instances, is that when you're using version 11 or higher of ThinManager and version 11 higher of FactoryTalk View SE, a client device, a terminal, will consume a single client license regardless of how many sessions you're sharing, either tiling, virtual screen, multi-monitor, whatever you're doing. And that can save some significant licensing. So let's take a look at a few different instances here. And we'll look at a fairly simple one first. So we have our HMI server running FactoryTalk View SE. We have 2 remote desktop servers, RDS1 and 2. Each one has ThinManager on it, so we have a redundant ThinManager pair. And we have those remote desktop sessions. They're co-located there, and they're running our FactoryTalk View SE client session. I have 4 client, Thin client devices out on the plant floor. So what that means is I would need 4 SE client licenses, 1 for each device. Now, if we're going to do standard or instant failover from remote desktop, since I have 2 remote desktop sessions, I can host those remote desktop, those client sessions on both remote desktop servers. And if one isn't available, the other one can still be available. So I have high availability with my content. If I'm going to host that, you can see that in version 11, I still only need those 4 licenses, whether I do standard or whether I do instant failover. But in prior versions or in other software models outside of FactoryTalk View SE, I'm going to need to have enough licensing for my applications running on both remote desktop servers. Even though I'm only using 4 clients at any given time, I would need 8 licenses for each. If we take a look at that, expand it out a little bit, or change up a little bit, in this case, it's the same scenario for our server scenario, but instead of having 4 separate clients, I have a single thin client that I'm going to tile or virtual screen deliver all 4 of my sessions to. So in this instance, because we have this almost per device license, we have this setup with FactoryTalk View SE and ThinManager 11. Whether I'm doing standard failover, whether I'm doing instant failover, I need a single client license. You can see I would need 8 client licenses no matter what using anything else in order to get that same functionality. So this is a huge cost savings and a great reason to adopt either version 11 or version 12 of ThinManager and FactoryTalk View SE. Last one, since I can squeeze one last one on here, this would be just, for those instances where maybe you're running a licensing server. The licensing isn't on the remote desktop sessions or on the remote desktop servers themselves. It might be another point of failure in the system out there. Now, if that goes down, you lose your licensing. But the fact of the matter is, it's out there. And so in this instance, you still have a savings between standard failover and instant failover, because those same 4 client licenses, 1 per device, is all that I need to license my applications. Whereas in the past or with other manufacturers' HMIs, I may need to duplicate that licensing in order to have enough for instant failover, which we'll talk about when we get to the deployment options in the next section. Any questions come in for licensing while we were doing that? I didn't see anything. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into some best practices here for the actual architecture of a ThinManager system. First and foremost, this is just a slide full of links. These are very helpful, useful documents, and most of what we've talked about so far and most of what we're going to talk about for the rest of this presentation came from these documents, and this will be a nice repository where you can easily click on those and go from there once you get a copy of the presentation. So I've talked about ThinManager redundancy, and I've talked about remote desktop failover a little bit, but I didn't explain what those things were in depth. So let's just cover those again and make sure we talk about it. So redundancy, we're talking about for ThinManager. This is 2 running instances of ThinManager server synchronized together. If the primary goes down, secondary is still there, running exactly the same way, taking over, off you go. Redundancy in ThinManager is a add-on license. It's a separate license. You do buy it in the same quantity that you would buy your ThinManager VFlex licensing on, but it is a reduced price. It's about 50% of the licensing to do redundancy. And when regardless of which server is running, administrators have full capability to do all the configurations within ThinManager. ThinManager will still serve up that firmware and that profile to all the clients. It really is a true redundant scenario. But redundancy is great. ThinManager is up and running. It can deliver the content or the profiles and the firmware, and I can make changes no matter what. But that doesn't help me if my remote desktop server goes down. If I have a single remote desktop server and that goes down, then I lose my content, and ThinManager has nothing to serve. So when we're talking about failover, that is the remote desktop services function of high availability. And the 2 options there, I already kind of mentioned them, but we'll go over them here. Standard failover, and in standard failover, you have 2 servers configured. The primary is running. If the primary should fail, then the secondary would then spin up those sessions and serve them up, and then ThinManager would offer them up to the clients. So in a standard failover scenario, there will be a delay. There will be maybe a slight interruption of content delivery. So whatever length of time, whether it be seconds or even minutes that it takes for those images to spin back up or those sessions to spin back up on the secondary remote desktop server, during that time frame, you won't have access to the content in ThinManager. Instant failover is exactly that. And instant failover allows for little to no interruption at all. In most cases, the operator has no idea that it's even switched. And that's because simultaneously, those windows those remote desktop sessions are running on both servers. And so the plus side is it's instantaneous. You've got this super fast changeover, very little to no interruption whatsoever in serving content. The downside is, in a lot of instances, that might mean duplication of application licensing. So if you've got, SE, and we talked about how we're doing per device licensing, and that's great and that's fantastic. But if you're serving up Logix, or if you're serving up Microsoft Excel, if you're serving up anything else, then you need to make sure that you have the necessary licensing to duplicate that running simultaneously on both or on multiple remote desktop servers. That's sort of the high availability and redundancy part of ThinManager and remote desktop server. When we look at remote desktop server, again, it's not necessary for a ThinManager deployment, but nearly all, and I recommend all, should consider it because of the ease of centralized configuration. A really great or a necessary component built into ThinManager that I love to talk about is called Smart Session. And what Smart Session is the equivalent of load balancing between multiple remote desktop servers. But unlike configuring load balancing in the remote desktop server environment, which is, something I'm sure IT people are very familiar with and do all the time, this is configured within ThinManager with a few clicks and selections within the wizard. So it's also configured per display client. So it's a setting you do as you're configuring your display client or the actual content you're going to share. So you don't have to necessarily do smart sessions or load balancing for every display client or every remote desktop. So it basically gives you have a pool of remote desktop servers, 1, 2, 3, however many it might be. They're running your applications, whether that be SE client applications, Microsoft Excel, Solitaire, whatever you want to run on them. ThinManager, then based on the load balancing parameters that you select through the wizard as you set things up, ThinManager will then decide which server has the least heavily load, is least heavily loaded, and it will run the application on that server so that you have a better performance. And this, again, not necessary in smaller ThinManager applications, not necessary in all applications, but it's there, it's built in the ThinManager. And again, unlike the IT equivalent, which I'm sure IT people know how to set up for an automation or an OT side person, it's a wizard-driven selection that you do within the configuration of your display client. I'm going to take a couple of quick looks at some sample architectures before we finish up with the best practices here and jump into some networking stuff. When you look at this sample architecture, you can see this is a redundant ThinManager architecture, and it just sort of layers in right on top of what we already have running in our plants today. You can see around the firewall section in the middle of the screen there that ThinManager actually has a very low port count. There's a single port used to deliver the firmware to terminals. There's a single port for delivering that terminal profile. And then there's a port that we use for terminal shadowing. And then, of course, the port that's used for the actual RDP content itself. But overall, it's a fairly low port count. So it's easy to set up when you have to manage things through firewalls or when you're worried about security. And IT can really embrace that low port count because there's a lot less that it's going to have to deal with there. Looking at a sample architecture, probably talking about this, one of the most common questions that I get and that we get in the automation system group when talking about ThinManager is how many remote desktop servers will I need to run my architecture? I've got 100 clients on my FactoryTalk View SE system, or I have 50 clients. How many remote desktop servers should I plan on getting? Unfortunately, there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to that. It is dependent on a multitude of factors. And the best way to determine the answer is to take a look at the consumed resources. And we'll cover that a little bit in a minute. But so in this instance, we're going to take it, this instance, we've got 20 clients running in our system here. And we've already done our little calculations that we're going to talk about in the next slide. And we've factored out that we can run 10 clients per remote desktop server. So I've got 20 clients. I can do 10 per remote desktop server. And in this instance, I'm going to recommend that you put in 3 remote desktop servers. And I know that you're probably saying, well, 10 plus 10 is 20. And I do realize that. And that sounds like 2 remote desktop servers would be sufficient. But the reason I recommend a third is because I'd like to include one simply for failover. So You have remote desktop server 1 that's handling clients 1 through 10. You got remote desktop server 2 that's handling clients 11 through 20. And then you'd have this remote desktop server F that basically has the sessions running to handle failover for sessions 1 through 20. That way, if either server goes down, you lose no content. Everything's still being served up. And in this example, you know, it's like, okay, well, so you're talking about adding a third remote desktop server instead of a second one. That sounds like a lot more to manage. But you've got to remember that this is a realistic scenario. And what we're actually talking about here is reducing our hosting infrastructure from 20 hosted applications or 20 operating systems where View SE would have been running down to 3 operating systems. And those 3 operating systems, now with failover, ensuring high availability, are going to significantly reduce the overall maintenance and management of the devices and reduce the threat vulnerability footprint from a cybersecurity standpoint, because instead of 20 devices, I'm managing 3. So that's why I would scale up and be sort of conservative when it comes to that. And again, as we scale out, you know, okay, so now we go up to 100 instead of 20. Does that mean that I'm going to do the same thing? I'm going to break it up into, you know, 10 per remote desktop and then have 1 for failover? Well, no. I'd probably then recommend that you have at least 2 for failover. One doing sessions 1 through 50 and another one doing sessions 50 through 100. Again, giving you high availability, still reducing a significant number of OSs to manage and bringing that into a secure server operating system to begin with. But on top of that, also now giving you that high availability for failover. So those are the type of things that I like to look at when we're talking about scaling the architecture. Coming back to sizing that remote desktop server and how we come up with the idea of, oh, well, I can run 10 client sessions on this one. The simplest way, and the way that probably most of us start out doing it, is we launch a server. We set it up with a remote desktop server, and we go ahead and we launch our first application and we record the resource. Then we go ahead and launch a second instance of the application. We record the resources. And we do that maybe 3 or 4 times to get a baseline of how the hardware handles the load. The one benefit or the one good thing that we have going for us here is that remote desktop services tend to be very linear, or at least fairly linear. They don't fail gracefully when you reach your maximums, but they are fairly linear. So from that baseline, you can then sort of plan out and determine, if I'm going to do 50 sessions, what am I looking at for a load? And therefore, how should I best spread that out? How many servers should I implement? Rockwell does have some remote desktop server sizing recommendations published, and they're from the Plant PAX team. They're generally set up and configured around the idea of the Plant PAX system, which is categorized and tested and thoroughly set out. But it does make for a good starting place for ThinManager too, because you can take that documentation and you can use it as a starting place to say, okay, based on what they say here, I would need 2 remote desktop servers to run that many sessions. That's where I'm going to start. Now let's see where we go from there. Another great resource that we use when we're helping customers determine this is from one of our Encompass partners, Stratus. They offer ZTC Edge, which is an edge computing server for virtual running servers, as well as their fault tolerant server. And both of those have Excel sizing tools that you can utilize to estimate the load that's going to be on those servers. Well, part of estimating that load is estimating your remote desktop load if you're using a remote desktop server with those. And again, their hardware may be different than the hardware you're buying, but it does give you a starting point. So there are some starting points you can take from, but size conservatively, I guess, would be my main point when it comes to picking out your remote desktop hardware. Last couple things in the architectures before we bounce on into the next section of security. I did want to, not going to spend any real time on it, but ThinManager does have some guidance that's out there. It's actually in the security document on the links page that we had at the beginning of this section for deploying ThinManager across an industrial DMZ, and also for deploying ThinManager across multiple sites. Actually using ThinManager, you can manage ThinManager locally at those sites, but then also bring those implementations of ThinManager back to an enterprise level, so to speak, back to an implementation where you can manage and even get right down and shadow a terminal on a remote plant, as long as you have the capability to get to that network. And so they have guidance set up for how to set those things up and how to do those things. We really just don't have the time to cover that. I'm going to try and hop through these security ones as fast as possible so that we can squeeze into the time frame here with the rest of the best practice, the tips and tricks. But let's go ahead and look at it. The first and foremost thing I want to talk about when it comes to security and ThinManager is the users part, or they call them relevance users, but the ThinManager users you configure. Relevance users can be synchronized to an Active Directory. And now beyond just being able to then use Active Directory users that are now in ThinManager by doing that synchronization, it actually gives you the ability to manage the Active Directory user from ThinManager. And that sounds like it might not be a good thing, but it actually is a wonderful thing, because if you've got the right people, the administrators there, you've got the ability to now deliver content that may be secured by the Active Directory standpoint at a level that an operator on the plant floor shouldn't necessarily be able to access without passwords they shouldn't have. You have the ability to now deliver that content through ThinManager to the plant floor, to an operator who's authorized to see it in ThinManager without necessarily knowing or having to know any of the Active Directory stuff that it had to go through to get it there. The other advantage is you can manage those passwords from ThinManager directly back synchronized with the Active Directory server. So it gives you a lot of flexibility, sort of a both-way street. It's not just getting users from the Active Directory server, it gives you some management capabilities in ThinManager as well. Access groups and permissions, pretty standard for anything that uses security. I mean, you have the ability to group your users and set up your access controls, and you can do a lot more. We're going to show here about who has access to what in ThinManager, as opposed to just who has access to what in content. But that's all available through ThinManager as well. Multi-factor authentication is something that's becoming more and more of a thing. And we really, without ThinManager, we'd have a lot of problems natively with some of our software and hardware getting this type of support. So you can require one type of authentication when you want to deliver content, or you can require any combination of the types of authentication ThinManager has. So nowadays, especially nowadays, you know, when I walk up to a terminal and I want to log into it, maybe I don't want to touch that touch screen and enter my name in. Maybe I'd rather use a badge and wave it in front of a reader, or a wearable device that waves in front of a scanner that logs me in to ThinManager, passes those credentials through, and off I go, logged in. Now I don't have to worry about the surfaces being touched by multiple people and things along those lines. So those are some of the nice factors there. When we look at what we have passwords, of course. We have PIN numbers you can use for authentication. You also have RFD badges, biometrics like fingerprint scanners, retinal scanners, and now in version 12, even facial recognition. And any combination can be used to make sure that you're securing things. We already did the pass-through. I think you saw that when we did the demo. Mark's logged into SE. That does require FactoryTalk View SE 10 or higher, ThinManager version 10 or higher, and you need to be having users that are linked to an Active Directory, both within ThinManager and the FactoryTalk environment. Groups and permissions, we're not going to spend a lot of time here, but know that it is incredibly granular. You can allow people to have access to certain things within ThinManager. I can shadow a terminal and things like that, but I don't necessarily have to be able to then be able to go in and configure things within ThinManager. So it's very granular. You can set that up. The last thing really in the networking side of things is the port. And I said earlier, ThinManager is you know, sort of low on the port count or light on the port count. Here's a listing of all the ports used by ThinManager. And this slide not only is a great reference material just so you have it, but it's really great when it comes to troubleshooting, because honestly, when you start to troubleshoot a ThinManager deployment, if you have something going on, networking issues are a great place, or maybe the first place you should start when troubleshooting. So checking to make sure that your ports are open where they need to be between servers or between clients and servers. These things are where you would start to make sure your deployment runs well. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'm just going to bounce straight into the tips and tricks. We only have a couple of slides here. Hopefully, if you've stayed with us this longer, you'll be willing to ride a couple more seconds. And then if there are any questions, we'll hit them at the end. So APPLINK. Although this isn't really a tip or a trick, it's something that's built into ThinManager when we're setting up a display client. It's so incredibly powerful that I felt it really needs to be spoken about on its own slide here. So it's an incredibly powerful way to deliver content to the plant floor. Instead of delivering a desktop environment to your Thin client, AppLink or application link allows you to deliver just that application or just the applications you need to that terminal. If an operator goes ahead and closes that, maybe they're trying to get to the desktop or they want to get to Solitaire, they close that application, what they're faced with or what they get is just a black void. There's a black screen there, it sits there, ThinManager says, oh, wait a minute, that session has been closed, spins it right back up, delivers it exactly the way you have it configured to be delivered, they're right back in that session again. This capability is this application-only delivery without the shell, without the in a shell, without the desktop or anything along those lines. It's available in remote desktop. You can configure this in remote desktop sessions. But I'm an automation person, and I really don't know how to do that. In ThinManager, it is a checkbox. And a checkbox, that's something I can handle. I click that, and now I have application. And this is how ThinManager delivers powerful IT capabilities with easy-to-use OT-centric widgets. Modules. This is probably the one takeaway that you can take for ThinManager if you're looking for a tip or a trick. Modules are how we manipulate or how we grant capabilities to our Thin client hardware. So I said way back when that by default, a Thin client has the ability to recognize a keyboard or a mouse via USB, not anything else. But what if I wanted something else? What if I wanted to use that RFID badge reader? Or I wanted to add a thumbprint scanner or something along those lines. That's what the modules do. Think of them almost like drivers for Thin client. So I picked out a handful of modules that are pretty powerful here. It's important to remember ThinManager supports right now well over 75 different modules, all different types, crazy amounts of stuff, and they add more each and every version. But we'll start here with networking. So if I have a dual Ethernet port Thin client, I can use the redundant Ethernet module to configure that second Ethernet port to be used in a redundant star topology. Now, if I have that same client and instead of the redundant Ethernet module, I add the second Ethernet module to that same Thin client, well, now that second Ethernet port can have its own separate Ethernet IP address, either dynamically assigned or statically assigned. So it can actually sit on a different network, or the Thin client can sit on multiple networks. And although that sounds like a bad idea, and some of our IT friends' heads might explode when we say that, the primary use case we see there a lot is for IP camera networks. If you want to tie those cameras in directly to the Thin client for the area that Thin client's in, you could do that with a dual port client, giving each one a separate network. Moving into the user interface, the key block module has got to be my favorite module in the world, and it does exactly what it says. It blocks Windows hotkeys or key combinations like Control-Alt-Delete, the Windows key, Alt-Tab. You can customize it to the exact combinations, no matter what the operator does trying to press those keys. ThinManager will never pass those keys, those key combinations into the session. So it disables them completely. Along the same lines, you have lots of touchscreen modules available that give you different capabilities. You know, what you're going to do when you do a long hold on the screen versus, you know, a short press, things along those lines. And then we have the RFIDs PC prox module, which I use with my demo here. That gives me that badge reader. So instead of having to type in my username, I've got this badge that I use to open the door to get into the room anyway. So I can now use that to log in not only to ThinManager, but also to my underlying SE deployment, as long as we're running that newer FactoryTalk View SE deployment. So we are running out of time, so I'm going to try and just jump through the last tools slide here as quick as possible. These tools are sort of built into ThinManager and offer some really nice capabilities. The top one, probably the most important, this is the TermMon ActiveX control. And what that basically does is it exposes a lot of events and methods from not just ThinManager, but also the remote desktop services, and allows applications that can use ActiveX controls, such as FactoryTalk View SE, Microsoft Excel, you name it, stuff like that. It allows them to see things like IP addresses for a specific terminal, or the current location of a certain mobile device, or which user is logged into terminal X. The ActiveX control also has some two-way communication there that can be useful, such as it can actually switch what content is being shown on the screen, or turn on or off the tiling capability. And an example I like to give for that, let's say that I have a control room and I have various HMI content being shared on my terminal in the control room. But out on one of the lines, I have a robotic arm moving around, and that area is protected by light curtain. Well, I can use the ActiveX control to force the camera feed from that robotic area, that robot arm area, to the control room terminal whenever the light curtain is broken. It doesn't matter. I mean, I have logic, I'm sure, written in the controller that stops that robotic arm before someone gets hurt when that light curtain is broken. But this ActiveX can drive that screen, that visualization, so that the operator has eyes on the danger immediately, even if they weren't aware of it. Very powerful. Reporting and notification, exactly as it sounds. You have the ability to generate reports about what's going on in ThinManager and send notifications to pop-ups on the terminal, emails, messaging, however you want to do it. You can group servers and terminals together so that you can make configuration easier. You've got a bunch of terminals that are going to be doing the same thing. You group them into a terminal group. Now you can apply some global properties to those terminals, and they inherit it, and you don't have to set it up individually on each one. Touch and mouse buttons. I did that when I was doing my tiling and things along those lines. When I right-clicked, I was able to go to tile. When I left-clicked, I was able to go to full screen. That's part of built into the mapping that you can do there. I'm going to jump right down to the last one, that virtual thin client. Again, extremely powerful. And in this case, I was using it when we did our little demo there. I took a VMware image, opened it up, didn't install an operating system, nothing there. Then I used that Pixie boot, that pre-execution boot, to go ahead and deliver my ThinManager firmware and my ThinManager content to a VMware image. And so this gives you the ability to go ahead and fire up multiple virtual clients and test out your system long before you even have your hardware present and on site. So it's a very powerful tool. I think with that, I've gone over in time. So I will open it up to any questions that might be out there. But otherwise, I do appreciate you sticking through, and we do appreciate you tuning in for these. If you have any questions and you didn't have a chance to offer them up here at the end, please feel free to contact me. My contact information is on the screen, and I do appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining. All right. Doesn't look like any questions came through. So again, I do thank you very much for your time. Thanks for tuning in. And don't forget, Automation Fair at home. Sign up, register. Lots of great information coming your way.